Please be seated. Back on the record, this is the people of the state of Colorado versus James Egan Holmes, case number 12CR1522. The record should reflect that Mr. Holmes is present with his attorneys and the prosecutors are present as well. Let's bring the jury in, please. By the way, we have to stop at 12 because one of the jurors, I think, is giving blood at noon, and so she has to leave right at 12. So we'll take our lunch break between 12 and 1:30. Please be seated, everyone. The record should reflect that the jury is back in the courtroom. Members of the jury, I want to remind you that the court has admitted the testimony of Dr. Metzner only for a limited purpose. You may consider this testimony only as to the issues raised by the defendant's plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. You shall not consider this evidence for any other purpose. Mr. Brockler, you may resume your direct examination. And Dr. Metzner, I remind you that you're still under oath, okay?
Yes, sir.
All right, thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Metzner, we had left off with sort of getting to the point where we were going to conduct this 25 and a half hours of face-to-face assessment down in Pueblo at the state hospital. Do you recall that?
Yes.
A couple things I want to ask you about. You mentioned that it was important for you to incorporate in the Google chats with the defendant's ex-girlfriend and the texts from the subsequent woman in the grad course. Did you spend time going through the notebook with the defendant?
Yes, I went line by line through the notebook with Mr. Holmes.
And in fact, did you create one of your appendices as part of that 129-page report? Was that a going through line by line with the defendant of the notebook?
Correct.
Now, let's talk in general terms about, through the course of the 25 and a half hours, a couple things to get out there. One, was the defendant cooperative with you the whole time that you talked with him?
I would say so, yes.
Now, other than cooperation, did you, and we'll talk about this when we move forward, but did you find some difficulties in getting certain information out of him?
Yes, and it was similar to what you saw in the videotape with Dr. Reed. It was not uncommon to get answers to questions that I don't know, and I would follow up not only in that particular interview where I got a I don't know answer, but in subsequent interviews, similar questions trying to get more information. And Sometimes I got more information, and sometimes I don't know.
You referenced Dr. Reed's video. If we were going to try to describe for the jury the defendant's affect during the 25 and a half hours that you had with him, was it consistent with what we saw in there?
Yes.
Did you ever see, and I want to describe something for specificity with you, did you ever see the defendant have face red, grimacing like crying, hands tightening, anything like that?
No.
Also, based on your assessment of, I think, subsequent psychological testing, did you have psychological testing done subsequent to your interviews?
Yes, I had both neuropsychological testing and psychological testing done by Dr. Rose Mancuso and Dr. Thomas Gray, who were both psychologists at the Colorado Mental Health Institute at Pueblo.
And you've worked with them before?
Yes.
Okay. Based on that, and based on even your own face-to-face assessments, you don't have any concerns about any issues of malingering on behalf of the defendant?
I do not. I do not think that Mr. Holmes was faking an illness.
Okay. Let's talk now in terms of how we approach answering those questions that are part of this sanity evaluation. You said the first prong that you look at is one involving whether or not there's a certain mental disease or defect. I'm going to ask you, do you look to see if there is a serious mental illness based on how you defined it before?
That's, yes.
Tell us what a serious mental illness is.
Well, a serious mental illness is a mental disorder that's associated, at least intermittently, with psychotic features. And what I mean by psychotic features is psychosis is a type of mental disorder that's associated with someone having a significant impairment in reality testing, to being able to tell the difference between what's real and what's not real. You usually see that impairment via symptoms in one of the 5 following areas. You may see someone who has a delusional belief, and I understand the jury's heard what delusions mean. You can also see someone who has hallucinations, and the most common kinds of hallucinations is auditory hallucinations, meaning that someone hears something, hears somebody, hears a voice that's not really there. So there's a perception without an actual stimulus. You can also get visual hallucinations where you see things that aren't really there. You can also have what's called a thought disorder, and that's usually manifested by disorganized thinking. It can also be manifested by disorganized writing, but a thought disorder. You can also get symptoms, motor abnormalities. And when I talk about motor abnormalities, I'm talking about nonverbal behavior, movements. And you, so for example, in the video that Dr. Reed did, you can see Mr. Holmes doesn't move around a lot, doesn't use his hands a lot for expressions. But some people can be hyperactive and some people can be hypoactive, not very active. And the 5th area that you can see in psychosis is what's called negative symptoms. And again, there's a variety of negative symptoms. They include a paucity, lack of emotional response, which is often referred to as a flatness of affect. You can also see what's called alogia, which means paucity of speech. A person doesn't talk a lot. And there's some thought that that's actually related to what you see in certain neurological conditions that are called aphasia. It's a form of aphasia where there's difficulty with speaking. You can also see what's called, talking about negative symptoms, what's called avolition. And avolition means that someone doesn't have the kind of motivation to do things that they used to have. You can also see what's called anhedonia. And what that means is that they experience much less enjoyment in activities that used to be enjoyable to them. I think I've covered all the negative symptoms. So if you have a psychosis, people who have psychosis are often referred to as being psychotic.
Now, pardon me, if someone has a delusion, are they then diagnosable as being psychotic or have a psychosis?
Yes, by definition, if you have a delusion, you're psychotic.
Now that delusion, does psychiatry, as far as you know, have like a Richter scale for earthquakes, like they say, oh, that's a class 10 delusion, or oh, that's just a class 1 delusion, or is it like being pregnant? You're it or you're not it?
You're either delusional or you're not. What psychiatry does do, you can classify various delusions. So, for example, it's not uncommon to see paranoid delusions. The paranoid delusion would be characterized by the FBI's out to get me, or the CIA's following me, or Joe Smith is out to kill me. And if all that is inaccurate and fixed in the sense that if you try to confront the person with the reality that this isn't true, then that would meet a paranoid delusional belief. You can also see grandiose delusions. You'll see some people who say, I'm Jesus Christ. That would be an example of a grandiose delusion. You can also see erotic delusions. That means Jill is in love with me, and she just doesn't want to tell me that, but she's in love with me, and there's no basis for that. So they're common delusions. And then you can have a delusion such as Mr. Holmes had that doesn't fit into any one of those categories, but that doesn't make it any less delusional.
Before we get back to defining the specific delusion that you found in this case, let's just give the jury a better sense too of, are there other diagnoses that fit the definition of serious mental illness that are not psychotic or delusional in nature?
Yes. So for example, you could have what's called a major depressive disorder, and that means major depressive disorder means that you're profoundly depressed and you have a number of biological markers, biological symptoms such as sleep disturbance, weight loss, appetite disturbance related to your depression. And you can have a depressive disorder with psychotic features or a depressive disorder without psychotic features. But that major depressive disorder is considered a serious mental disorder because it's associated with significant functional impairments, meaning people who have major depressive disorder frequently have a very hard time getting out of bed. They perform poorly at work. They have memory and concentration problems. That would be an example. Or there's certain kinds of personality disorders in which a small percentage of those personality disorders are associated with significant functional impairments and interpersonal or occupational relationships that would meet criteria for serious mental disorder. So a good example actually is, I understand part of Dr. Reed thought that the most likely diagnosis for Mr. Holmes was a schizotypal personality disorder. That would certainly, particularly with the symptoms that Mr. Holmes had, would qualify for a serious mental disorder.
Let's talk a little bit about the delusion, and then we'll try to get into what relevance it has to what we're going to call a differential diagnosis, okay? First off, did you determine that the defendant back on the 19th and 20th of July 2012 had a delusion as you've defined it?
In my opinion, he did.
Tell us what that is.
His delusion was that he would increase his self-worth by killing people. And the delusion was, by killing people, the worth that each of those individuals had would be transferred in some fashion to him that would make him that would increase his worth. A second part of his thinking was also that if he could increase his worth, he would be less depressed and would feel better.
Talk to us a little bit more about the increasing the self-worth part from the standpoint of, was he talking to you in terms of Was this delusion about self-worth or worth to other people, money in the bank? How did it work?
It would be his self-worth, that he would be worth more in some manner than he was prior to killing someone.
Did he tell you how he quantified that worth? For instance, let's say like a point per person or something else?
Well, he tried to. And I asked him specifically about that, and he talked about that, first of all, different people have different worth. So someone who is a surgeon is likely to be worth more than someone who does janitorial work. And then the worth was, let me be...
And doctor, just for the record, if you're refreshing your memory about what your opinion was based on and what it was, just tell us that, hey, I'm referring to my report, and tell us the page number that you gave.
I am referring to my report, and I'll tell you the page number shortly. Okay, it's on page 10. And so I tried to get clarification from him regarding how he measured a person's worth. And he stated that included the following factors: the number of people killed, your own perception of what a life is worth, and your contribution to society, both in a meaningful and positive way.
Did he discuss with you the value of children?
Yes, he thought that children were probably worth more because they had a longer life ahead of them.
But not a 1 point, everybody's equal kind of a thing?
Objection leading.
Overruled.
Go ahead, sir.
He did not give me a 1 point, everyone's equal verbally. However, when you try to make sense of his notebook, there's lots of 1 pluses and zeros, but I did not obtain the history that Dr. Reed reported about 1 point per person.
Did he use the phrase human capital with you in discussing this?
Well, yes, because it was actually a leading question for me, because in the notebook it talks about human capital. So one of my questions when I'm going over the notebook, going line by line, what do you mean by human capital?
So this was the delusion that you found that he had.
Yes.
And I know that we've talked about him wanting to feel better as well, and thinking that killing people would help him feel better.
Objection. That misstates the testimony of this witness. The testimony of this witness was that if he increased his value, it would alleviate his depression.
All right, sustained. Rephrase your question.
Sure. Is a component of the delusion, did it have something to do with this value impacting how he felt about himself?
He was hopeful that if he could increase his self-worth, that would result in him feeling less depressed.
And is it your opinion that but for the defendant believing he could alleviate those feelings and increase his self-worth, he would not have engaged in this behavior?
Yes, it's my opinion that but for the delusion, he would not have acted he would not have done what he did.
Now, if that's true, why isn't that insanity? Why isn't that lack of capacity on the grounds that we've discussed here this morning?
Because the sanity statute is a very narrow definition, which talks about capacity to distinguish the difference between right from wrong, and talks about capacity to form the culpable mental state. It does not talk about, in a general sense, causation. And when I say but for, that's really a causation opinion, but that's not, that doesn't have anything to do with the specific capacity that the statute talks about.
Does it mean that the defendant was not able to make decisions and act on his own will?
What I'm hesitating about is will is a nebulous term.
Okay.
So if you can ask me a different way.
I think when we get through the capacity discussion, that part will make sense.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. There is an aspect of this trying to, talk about whether there's a delusion, and that delusion means psychosis and the serious mental illness to get through the first prong. What it feels like is there's also an effort in satisfying that first prong to try to diagnose whatever it is that people think that the defendant has, both back on the 19th and 20th of July 2012 and now. Is that fair?
Judge, I'm going to object to the form of the question. There's a long narrative where counsel's testifying, essentially, and then a short question at the end. It's an inappropriate form of a question.
I don't know that it was counsel testifying, but I will sustain the objection as to the form of the question. Rephrase the question.
Thank you, Your Honor. Did you attempt to make something called a differential diagnosis about the defendant based on all the information and things that you did in this case?
I did.
First, tell us what a differential diagnosis is.
Okay, so a differential diagnosis is the list of the most likely conditions or diagnoses that would account for a person's presentation. So, for example, if you go to your family physician and your chief complaint is that you are short of breath, your chief complaint is that you have a fever and you're short of breath. The doctor's going to take a history from you. He's going to do a physical exam, and then he's going to come up with a differential diagnosis. And he'll say, well, you may have pneumonia, you may have the flu, you may have cancer. These are all possible diagnoses. And then he or she is going to do further testing and will eventually say, well, we know it's not cancer because your MRI was normal. And you narrow it down. That's what the differential diagnosis is. So after my examination, there was a whole bunch of symptoms that I think Mr. Holmes had, and I had to come up with a differential diagnosis. And so I came up with a differential diagnosis, and the differential diagnosis included the following: schizophrenia, what's called schizoaffective disorder, and I won't explain any of these right now. Schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, bipolar disorder, schizotypal personality disorder, trichotillomania, and social anxiety disorder. And included, before I came to that differential diagnosis, I ruled out malingering. And when I say I ruled out malingering, what that means is I considered it and I determined he wasn't malingering, so I ruled it out. I also ruled out antisocial personality disorder, and that was pertinent because if you have an antisocial personality disorder and that's related to capacity issues, is excluded by the statute. And I also ruled out what's called a dissociative identity disorder, and that used to be known as multiple personality disorder. So that was my initial differential diagnosis. Then from that differential diagnosis, I said that the most likely diagnoses were schizoaffective disorder, social anxiety disorder, trichotillomania, and that because I diagnosed him as most likely having a schizoaffective disorder, that meant that the schizotypal personality disorder was premorbid to the schizoaffective disorder.
Tell us what premorbid is before you move on.
So when you look at schizoaffective disorder or schizophrenia, there's certain criteria that you have to meet in order to get that diagnosis. One criteria is that you have to exhibit certain signs of psychosis for at least a month. A second criteria is prior to the onset of those psychotic symptoms, you had to exhibit a variety of other symptoms, such as negative symptoms that we talked about, flat affect, sparse speech. And you had to exhibit those symptoms and other impairments for at least 6 months. That's called prodromal. That precedes the actual psychosis. The way schizophrenia and schizoaffective disorder is set up is that prodromal, before you're psychotic, that prodromal period would look like you have schizotypal personality disorder because all those symptoms are consistent with schizotypal. But once you make the diagnosis that he's now psychotic and it's really was the prodromal, the schizotypal personality was just preceding the psychotic break, then you no longer call it schizotypal personality disorder. You say schizotypal personality disorder, parentheses, prodromal. That's all it means.
Which one of those that you've talked about, and there's been a bunch, which one of those that you've talked about automatically means that someone is legally insane in Colorado?
None of those disorders mean automatically that you're legally insane. What you can say, in general, if you're going to meet and I say in general, if you're going to meet criteria for legal insanity in this state, the mental disease or defect you're going to have is going to be a serious mental illness that's associated with psychotic features. However, the vast majority, because the definition is so narrow around the capacity, the vast majority...
Judge, I'm going to be objecting to what other cases, the results in other cases might be.
Overruled?
Go ahead, sir. Keep going.
In general, let me just start over to get my thoughts correct. If you're going to meet legal criteria for insanity in this state, you're most likely to have a serious mental illness that is associated with psychotic features. The vast majority of people who have a serious mental illness associated with psychotic features don't meet criteria for legal insanity because the definition of legal insanity is so narrow.
Sorry. Is in part what we're talking about the difference between a diagnosis, a label, and how whatever that is affects somebody's function?
That's correct. And that's why, from my perspective, it doesn't make a difference whether the mental disease or defect is schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder or schizotypal, because none of those disorders are either more likely or less likely to meet legal insanity. He clearly, Mr. Holmes meets the prong of having a mental disease or defect. The next step is looking at function. As a result of those symptoms, of whatever you want to call that illness, did it result in him lacking the capacity to distinguish the difference between right from wrong, or lacking the capacity to form the culpable mental state. That's the issue.
Before we get into that next issue of how we are measuring function/capacity, what you relied upon, I want to ask you, within that serious mental illness label that makes the mental disease and defect prong that you talked about, is each one of these potential diagnoses, is there also, a spectrum in terms of some people with schizotypal personality disorder are really much worse off than other people that have schizotypal personality disorder? Or does it affect everybody the exact same way?
No, it doesn't affect everyone the same way. And the easy analogy is look at people with diabetes. Some people with diabetes do very well with anti-diabetic 1,800 calorie diet, and they control their diabetes. Other people with diabetes, diet alone doesn't help. They got to take insulin. And then other people who are on a diet, taking insulin, periodically need to get hospitalized. So there's a severity, there's a severity within the diagnosis, but with a given individual, someone could have a chronic mental illness and they're not psychotic all the time. And so there's times when they're clinically worse than at other times.
Let's move now to talking about the function, the capacity part. And I want to talk with you first about what you considered and thought was psychiatrically significant in evaluating the defendant for his capacity to know right from wrong based on societal standards of morality back on the 19th and 20th of July 2012, okay? And was that yes? I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's a yes.
As part of your evaluation of his capacity to know right from wrong on societal standards of morality, did you include as part of that an analysis of whether he knew he was violating the laws of that society?
I did.
Tell us what it is that helped you make that decision as you went through all of this stuff you've described.
Well, the easiest part in making that decision is what he told me. And Mr. Holmes was very clear in telling me that he knew that shooting people in a movie theater was not legal. It was against the law. So that's number one. And if you look at his actions, a lot of his actions, you don't need to be a forensic psychiatrist to come to the same conclusion. But I am a forensic psychiatrist, so I will give you examples. So, for example, his planning, the planning of the shooting was well thought out. Particularly, it's well documented in his notebook, and it was thought out in a manner to delay getting caught. And so, for example, the way he bought the ammunition, he bought the ammunition over time to not arouse suspicion from law enforcement or people who sell ammunition.
Now, is that your conclusion, or is that what he told you?
That's what he told me.
Okay, go on. What else did you consider?
He told me that he researched other mass murders.
Like what?
Specifically Columbine, to look at police response time. So already he's telling you that, why else are the police going to respond if you're not doing something that's illegal?
Since we're talking about his review of Columbine, did he have another reason for wanting to research Columbine that he told you regarding ammunition?
Well, he was looking at that both for police response time and the amount of ammunition that was used.
What other factors did you consider at this phase of your analysis?
Well, I think it was March 25 Gmail chat with his ex-girlfriend. He talks about The reason he hadn't done anything at that time is because you get caught and you would go to prison. He also talks about it being evil. And why is it evil? Because it's against the law. Let me just refresh my...
And if you are, just tell us what page of your report you're looking at, sir.
I'm going to go through a series of pages. I'm on page 14 now, and when you look at his profile on Match.com and Adult Friend Finder, in each one of them, there's a dating headline that asks, "Will you visit me in prison?"
And is it your understanding from the review of the discovery that that was posted before he mails this notebook to Dr. Fenton?
Yes.
Can I ask you about, you mentioned the diversion part of this thing to try to delay being apprehended. Was there something about his apartment specifically that dealt with that?
Yes, and thank you for reminding me that. Part of what he did, and I know the jury's heard testimony about it, so I will make it quick, is that he set up some incendiary devices in his apartment with the hope that if it worked, the police would be diverted to his apartment prior and would delay the response to the theater. And again, it goes knowing that the police were going to get involved. And why are the police going to get involved? Because it's illegal.
Further than that, why did he tell you that he wanted to delay the police becoming involved?
So that he could kill more people, which would increase his worth.
And when you talk to him, this is a slight step to the side on this. When you talk to him about this interest in killing people, this goal of killing people, did he ever tell you when he was carrying this out that he thought he would wound some but did not know he would kill?
No.
Sounds like to the contrary.
Correct.
Was it, I mean, how important is it in considering his capacity to evaluate the apartment and to understand not only what he did, but why he did it?
That was just another piece of evidence in my capacity assessment.
How about the text conversations over a period of time with the other woman from the graduate school after he'd broken up with his ex-girlfriend?
Well, yes, this is, I believe, it was either July 6th, 7th, or 8th. There's some confusion about the exact date. But that was the text, and I won't refer to her as his other girlfriend, but it was another student, in which this is the bad news bears text. And he basically said, "Stay away from me, the floodgates have opened." And he also, when I questioned him further about why she should stay away from him, is he indicated that it would be bad for her to have media exposure, meaning after this happened, he was aware that there was going to be media exposure.
And not positive media exposure.
Correct.
How about the fact that he made the purchases he did in terms of body armor and other protection?
That's also is consistent with knowing what he's doing is wrong, because he's anticipating people aren't going to just let him do that without taking some action. So he was trying to protect himself, and the people who would be taking action would be law enforcement.
I should have asked you this before because it doesn't sound like the evidence fits in little compartments. Could some of the stuff you're talking about now, we revisit this when we talk about the capacity to form the intent to murder after deliberation and to act knowingly?
Yes.
Okay, just so I got that on the record. In terms of further exploring this capacity to know right from wrong based on societal standards of morality, did you also consider things beyond just his acknowledgement or the evidence that he knew it was illegal?
Yes.
Tell us about that.
Well, what you can see with people who have delusional beliefs is someone with a delusional belief, there are certain delusions where they clearly know what they're doing is against the law, but believe they lose the capacity to recognize morality from a societal perspective. And so I had to evaluate, was there evidence that he either lost capacity or, as I said before, was there evidence that he in fact had capacity to know what societal morality was existing at that time.
Tell us the factors that you found to help you make the decision about his capacity to know this right from wrong.
Okay. So first of all, again, the capacity question is relevant at the time of the commission of the alleged acts. But to the extent that you can show he had that capacity or didn't have that capacity earlier on, that's important information. So you can start with the Gmail chat and the March 25 Gmail chat.
With his ex-girlfriend.
With his ex-girlfriend.
Go ahead.
And that's when he says that he's thinking about doing something evil. And and it gets clarified that what he's thinking about doing that's so evil is killing people, and that it's against the law. That's a good indication that using the term evil is an indication that at that time he had the capacity to distinguish right from wrong from a societal perspective.
What other things about that chat do you think went towards his capacity to know this right from wrong?
There's one other thing besides evil. The other thing is his friend at that time then says, well, why don't you kill Ben and I, who was another friend at that time? And he essentially says he can't do that, and because it would be too personal. And that again is getting into the capacity to recognize societal right from wrong. So Gmail chat is one. I'm going to refer to my report again. And
if it's refreshing your memory about this list of things, then just let us know and tell us the page you're on, sir. If
it is refreshing my memory.
While he's doing that, would counsel please approach for a moment?
Yes, sir.
Mr. Bruckler, you may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Did you find it, Doctor?
I did. So the first page is page 6. And again, the context is, and I'm aware that the jury is aware of this phone call, is once he was at the theater and he went out to his car and he got suited up, before he went back, he called the university he called the university, and that was the 9 or 10 second call where there was silence on the other end. And so I asked him about, why did you make that phone call? And the reason he made that phone call is, it was his, this is quotes, his last chance to turn back. I don't know, doubts, I guess. So that's an indication to me that he knew what he was doing was morally wrong. Also, when he was suiting up in the parking lot, he put on headphones. And when I asked him why he put on headphones, he was listening. He had programmed in loud techno music, and he said to me he did that so it wouldn't be personal. And then I questioned him further about what he meant by personal and why he didn't want it to be personal. And this is again page 6. I want to just quote what he told me. So there would not be a connection between me and the victim. I wanted generalized, being a crowd or group of people. Then it would not be like I was actually murdering somebody if no personal interaction, just random people.
Doctor, did he use the words victim and murdering?
Murdering he used. I don't think, yes, and victim too, yes.
Okay, go on.
So my understanding of that's in many ways similar to what he was saying in the March 25 Gmail chat, of why he wouldn't kill his friends, but would kill someone else. It was his psychological attempt to divorce himself from doing something, from considering the morality of that. But it indicates to me that he had the capacity to consider the morality.
Can I back up 1 second? And I want to make sure, I probably screwed this up with you, but on when you're talking about the Gmail chats, is that to a woman named Gargi?
Yes.
And then the texts to the subsequent woman, is that to a woman named Hillary?
Yes.
Okay, and those are the two names that apply to those two different
Correct.
pieces of evidence? I got it. All right. You talked about his efforts with the headphones. Were there other efforts that he described to you that were efforts to try to distance himself, and maybe distance is the wrong word, but to try to prevent him from fully appreciating or seeing what he was doing or hearing what he was doing? I don't know how to put that. And the impersonal part.
Give me a second.
Sure.
Well, there was other things that he did to try to distance himself from considering the morality of that. And so, for example, when I initially questioned him about why he dyed his hair, and it turned out it had nothing to do with the Batman movie. And he initially said he didn't know why he dyed his hair. And he speculated for me that it had to do with separating himself out from the person who did this from the person who's not doing that.
Is that a split personality?
Well, it's not a split personality. It's trying to distance yourself psychologically from doing something such as he did.
Is that an indication of capacity to know right from wrong based on the description that we've had?
I think it is.
How about his statements about killing children?
That was another key issue for me, is once he was arrested and taken to the police station, one of the questions he asked people questioning him was whether he had killed any children. And so I asked him about that. Why did you even ask that question? And the answer was, apparently, in the police station, there was some sign regarding children. I forget the exact title of it, but it reminded him of children. And he was concerned whether he killed children because he thought it was wrong, would not be the right thing to do to kill children.
How about his interactions with Drs. Fenton and Feinstein?
That's another indication that he clearly did not tell them what was going on in his mind in the planning that he had been engaged in.
Why is that significant to an understanding of his capacity?
Well, certainly it goes to knowing that what he was doing what was legally wrong. But I think when you think about going to a psychiatrist or a mental health professional, if there's any place that you have a fairly good chance of being able to talk and get a response in a relatively non-judgmental way, that would be the place. And he still chose not to do that.
And he tells you why, right?
Because they would have locked him up, meaning that they would have hospitalized him, which would have prevented him from being able to do this.
Now, over the course of these, and you spoke with Drs. Fenton and Feinstein?
I did.
Over the course of the several appointments that they had with him combined, and I know Dr. Fenton did some sort of, over that 3-month period, did he ever tell them or acknowledge that he'd had a specific target in mind for this mass murder?
No, he did not.
Did he ever tell them, including at the June 11th appointment, that he'd already spent the last month amassing the equipment necessary to pull off this mass murder?
He did not.
Does he instead tell them things in response to questions they ask that make them think that he's not as much a risk or prone to do this?
Objection. Leading calls for speculation.
Sustained as to leading, overruled as to speculation.
Doctor, are there questions that they ask him on June the 11th that are efforts to determine certain levels of stability for him about like his plans for the future?
Yes.
Objection. Leading.
Overruled.
Yes.
Tell us what it is that he told them.
They asked him about what he was planning to do after dropping out of school. And if I believe he told them that he was going to stay in his apartment for a while. And I think he told him he was going to stay in Denver for a while.
Did he indicate what he was going to do for work or school?
I don't recall.
Dr. Metzner, could you move the microphone closer to you, please?
Yes.
So everybody can hear you. Thank you.
The notebook itself, does it add some more information about what his, I guess, relationship was with these psychiatrists?
Well, not only the relationship with the psychiatrist, but it's another important component of why, in my opinion, he had the capacity to tell the difference between right from wrong. Specifically, I asked him, why did he send this notebook to Dr. Fenton? And his answer was that he wanted to help psychiatrists in the future to understand someone like him to prevent this from happening in the future. And the reason that shows, the reason that's relevant to capacity, if you had lost the capacity to know the difference between right from wrong, that would have meant that what you thought, you didn't think you were doing anything wrong. And if you didn't think that you were doing anything wrong, why would you want to alert psychiatrists in the future to prevent you from doing this?
What else was your opinion about why he mailed that notebook to Dr. Fenton?
I think Mr. Holmes was very angry at Dr. Fenton, and I think he had a general anger towards mental health professionals to begin with, and Dr. Fenton specifically, and for what she didn't do. And what she didn't do, and what Mr. Holmes, one of the reasons Mr. Holmes went to graduate school in neurosciences is for years he felt that something was wrong with him, something that was wrong with his brain. And one of his motivations for going, first of all, studying neurosciences in undergraduate school is to try to figure out what was wrong with his brain. That was one of his motivations, and it's clearly stated in his notebook, and it was clearly stated to me, of going to graduate school to not only find out what's wrong with his brain, but to try to fix it. So that didn't work. One of the reasons for seeing Dr. Fenton is trying to fix his brain, and that didn't work. And so I think he was very angry at her.
When he goes to see mental health, what is his stated reason for wanting to go there?
Well, the stated reason was that he was having significant anxiety during his presentations in graduate school. That was the stated reason. I don't think that was his only reason, because he made it very clear up front that he was having chronic homicidal thinking, and you don't tell someone that you have chronic homicidal thinking unless you want to get some help with that. So I think he wanted some help with that as well.
Doesn't the mere fact that he said he had some kind of homicidal thinking mean that he lacked the capacity to know right from wrong, or is it the opposite?
Action leading.
It's an either-or question, overruled.
It's certainly, having homicidal thinking does not mean that you can't tell the difference between right from wrong, and having homicidal thinking doesn't mean that you can tell the difference between right from wrong.
The individual concerns that the defendant details through his notebook, which we've seen, did he share any of those with Dr. Fenton?
Most of them he did not, and I talked with him about that, and that was in large part related to his negative symptoms and his difficulties in communicating, and I say in large part.
Well, you talked about this anger that you perceive that he has towards Dr. Fenton. What was significant, if anything, about the exchange where he wants her to tell him her philosophy of life?
Well, he was angry because she wouldn't tell him his philosophy. But the other place where anger came out, if you look in the notebook, and it's, again, not obvious until you question him about it, but he talks about the mind rapist. And, you know, when I first read his notebook, I had no idea of who the mind rapist was. But the mind rapist was Dr. Fenton, the psychiatrist. And there's nothing endearing about referring to another person as a mind rapist. It's pretty angry.
I should go back on this one other follow-up question on the homicidal thinking. The fact that he had a concern, or stated that he had a concern about these thoughts, does that have an impact on your evaluation of capacity to know right from wrong?
Yes, and it's another indication that he had the capacity to know the difference between right from wrong, because the homicidal thinking, I think, was disturbing to him.
Tell us, in terms of, was there anything else, by the way, that you thought was psychiatrically significant that you keyed on in terms of evaluating the defendant's capacity to know right from wrong based on societal standards of morality?
The last one would be his actions immediately after the shooting. You know, he just didn't drive away. he knew that he was going to be arrested. And so if he didn't have the capacity to know the difference between right from wrong, there would be no reason to be hanging around. You did what you needed to do and you leave, and that's not what happened.
Let's talk about that. You explored with the defendant. One, did he take any steps to put himself in a position to escape?
As part of his planning, yes.
What was that?
I think it's called the Road Stars. And he brought Road Stars with him. And the reason you'd bring Road Stars is if you were thinking about escaping.
And didn't he, in fact, tell you how he would use them?
I don't think that he told me about how he would use them. I think what he told me when I asked about that, his question was, I don't know.
Okay. And you don't remember writing in there anything about if he got into a chase?
Let me just refer to my
please,
report.
Please do, sir. And if I'm wrong, forgive me.
I think that's my language and not his.
Thank you for clarifying that. Thank you. You did talk with him, though, about his thoughts when he came outside the theater after shooting. Is that right?
Correct.
Well, tell us, why did he stay there? Why didn't he try to escape and use those Road Stars?
Well, he did an assessment when he came out of the theater, and when he came out of the theater, he already saw police, and he assessed that trying to drive away in all his body armor wasn't going to work, and that trying to escape wasn't going to work, and that's why he removed his guns and just stayed there and was pretty passive during the arrest process.
When you say he already saw police, did he give you something to tell you how he assessed how many police were there? And I don't mean numbers. I mean, did he tell you he felt like he was outnumbered?
He assessed that that there were enough there that he wasn't going to get away.
And in terms of the options available to him, was this the best one as he assessed it?
Objection. Calls for speculation.
You cannot speculate. If you can answer the question based on what the defendant said to you, then you can answer it. Otherwise, it would call for speculation.
It was the best from his perspective if he wanted to stay alive.
And why did he tell you he put his weapon down?
So that he wouldn't be shot.
How about his taking Vicodin before he left for this mass murder?
That's another factor in my capacity assessment. I asked him why he took Vicodin, and he was preparing for the possibility that he would get shot or injured during the shooting, and by having Vicodin on board, it would decrease the amount of pain that he would experience under such circumstances.
Can you talk to us, if you would, about the role of, and we've seen this word a bunch and heard it a bunch, of purpose and having a purpose in life for the defendant and how it impacted his thought process going into July the 19th, 20th of 2012?
Yes, I guess that gets into the symptomatology of his psychosis. And part of my assessment, based on information I got from Mr. Holmes directly and from in his notebook, I think Mr. Holmes had a significant depressive component to his psychosis, that he was very depressed. And in his notebook, he lists a number of symptoms of his depression. But for example, information that I got from him independent of his notebook is that he had what's called vegetative symptoms of depression. He was having appetite disturbance, sleep disturbance, feeling depressed. And part of his depression also was feeling like he lost his purpose in life. And so, for example, it was clear that he wasn't going to make it in graduate school. It was clear that, and as related to that, is that his brain wasn't going to be fixed as he hoped his brain was going to be fixed. He had lost the first really serious relationship that he ever had in his life. And so I think he was floundering. And you see that in his notebook with, the pages of why. Yeah, I think he was struggling with who he was and what was going to happen to him.
Is there a self-esteem aspect to some of this?
Yes.
There are a list of detailed questions I have for you about specific things that you found and that you didn't find. But before we break here, I want to ask you this. Did you form an opinion of the defendant's capacity to know right from wrong based on societal standards of morality for his conduct on July the 19th and 20th, 2012?
I did.
Tell us what that opinion is.
It was my opinion that despite having a mental disease or defect, that Mr. Holmes had the capacity to tell the difference between right from wrong from a societal standpoint at the time of the commission of the alleged crimes.
How confident are you in that opinion?
I'm extremely confident.
Did you formulate an opinion about the defendant's capacity to form the intent to murder after deliberation and to act knowingly back on the 19th and 20th of July 2012?
I did.
Tell us what that opinion is.
And again, my opinion was despite having a mental disease or defect at the time of the commission of the alleged acts, it's my opinion that Mr. Holmes did have the capacity to form the required culpable mental state for the crimes charged.
How confident are you in that opinion?
Extremely confident.
Those two prongs, all that having been met, did you formulate an opinion as to whether or not James Egan Holmes was sane when he murdered 12 people and attempted to murder 70 other people, whether he was legally sane on July the 19th and 20th, 2012?
Objection asked and answered. Object to the form of the question is argumentative.
Overruled.
Go ahead, sir. Tell us.
I did, and it's my opinion that Mr. Holmes, at the time of the commission of the alleged acts, met the criteria for legal sanity.
How confident are you in that opinion?
I'm extremely confident.
Your Honor, would now be a good time to break for...
Yes, it's 12 o'clock, members of the jury, and I understand that one of you is donating blood today and needs to leave at 12, and so we're going to go ahead and take our lunch break at this time. Please make sure that you follow all of my advisements with respect to your conduct when you're not in the courtroom during the break. I'll see you back here at 1:30. Enjoy your lunch. Please be seated, everyone. The record should reflect that the jury has exited the courtroom. Is there anything we need to talk about at this time, Mr. Brockler?
Your Honor, for planning purposes for the defense, I think I have maybe 15 minutes, 20 minutes at most when we return before I'll be done with direct examination.
Great. Thank you. Mr. King, anything from you?
Thank you.
Okay, I'll see you after lunch. The court will be in recess. Thank you.
Please rise.